Well, at my time of life, there's not many things that make me angry, but there's one thing that makes me very angry indeed. That's when I hear people who call themselves Marxists, saying things like the workers are not interested in art and culture. What we have here, comrades, is the mentality, not of the worker at all, but the mentality of an ignorant and pretentious petty bourgeois snob, and somebody that knows absolutely nothing about the working class or how it lives, feels, or thinks. Now, it is true that we live in a barbarous class society, which tends to produce a race of barbarians. That's true. I include in that number, not least, the barbarians with university degrees in their pockets. And in this barbarous class society, the worker is reduced to the role of a slave. The Romans used to describe it as instrumentum vocale, a tool with a voice, not a human being at all. And slaves are not required to think or feel at all. But you see, comrades, it is the essence of a revolution that for the workers to break free from the slave mentality, in moving to take the running of society into their hands, the masses suddenly begin to feel that they're not just robots or beasts of burden, but free men and women. Today's Sunday, isn't it? I hasten to assure the comrades that I am a Marxist and therefore an irreconcilable atheist. But I have read the Bible and it contains some very interesting ideas. And the Christians say that in order to accept the Christian religion, you must be born again. That's an interesting idea. You see, the working class is born again in a revolution. And by the way, maybe you've never lived through a revolution. I've seen several in my times. But the same miraculous transformation you can see actually in any strike. If you think about it, a strike is really a revolution in embryo on a small scale. And yes, one can observe the very same processes taking place in every strike. To use a Hegelian expression, with apologies to the translators, it's a process whereby the working class changes from a class in itself into a class in and for itself. That is to say, that they make real what was always there potentially. They achieve things, ordinary workers can achieve things that they never dreamed that they were capable of. You don't believe me? You speak to any worker that's participated in the strike, particularly a big strike, like the miners' strike in Britain. Now, I am a great admirer of the film Spartacus. I know there's some stupid petty bourgeois idiots that try to belittle this film. It shows that they're complete idiots that understand nothing, either about the film itself or about what a revolution is. And there's a marvelous scene in this film in which Spartacus, the leader of the great slave revolt, in a conversation with his beloved Varina, his wife, another slave, he confesses that in spite of all his victories on the battlefield, he still feels that he has achieved nothing because he cannot read and write. He begs Varina, who is literate, to teach him to read. Now, of course, you will tell me quite rightly that this conversation never actually took place. Of course it didn't. It's a piece of artistic license. And yet it expresses a very great truth about the nature of a revolution. In a revolution, the masses aspire to great things. They suddenly become aware that they've been kept in ignorance by their masters, and they have a burning desire to know. You know what that is? I'll tell you what it is. That is the very essence of a revolution. And whoever does not understand this can never be considered a revolutionary, but merely an ignorant Philistine. You can see this process of liberation. That's what it is, a process of liberation. In every great revolution in history, it was summed up brilliantly in the immortal lines in which the young English poet Wordsworth summed up his own feelings of the great French Revolution, which he personally experienced. He wrote the following: "Bliss 'twas in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven." You see, in order to carry out the socialist revolution, that is to say, the socialist reconstruction of society, the masses must be inspired by a great idea. They have to look beyond the immediate and see before them a new horizon, a new and better world, something higher and better than themselves, something that's really worth fighting for, and if necessary, giving their life for. Comrades, what are we really fighting for? A couple of euros on the pay packet, or a shorter working day? Better housing, perhaps? Better health service, perhaps? Yes, we fight for all of those things, of course. That goes without saying. But we are fighting for much more than that. We are fighting to build a paradise in this world. That's what we are fighting for. Neither more nor less. And that cannot be reduced. I'm very sorry to tell these smart guys, this great idea cannot be reduced to a question of a higher wage or a shorter working day. Important though such immediate and concrete demands may be, they're not our final goal. As is Sunday, you will forgive me for quoting the Bible. The Bible says, "Man shall not live by bread alone," my friends. Man shall not live by bread alone. And to reduce the revolutionary struggle for socialism to what is called bread and butter practical issues is to trivialize it. It's to trivialize our struggle. And as a matter of fact, it's to destroy it. Because in the final analysis, if we're going to reduce our struggle to the practical demands, that, by the way, was the policy of Edward Bernstein, the founder of revisionism. Practical demands, you know. Lenin poured scorn, rightly so, poured scorn and contempt on this contemptible rubbish. This is to reduce the class struggle, let's be clear about this, to the reformist notion of obtaining more acceptable conditions of life under capitalism. That's what it means. That is to say, this to reduce the working class to the passive role of contented slaves. The working class must never accept that role. The great historical task of the proletariat is to fight for the total abolition of slavery in all its aspects, not just the obvious aspects, not just the physical slavery of poverty, but the mental and spiritual slavery that stultifies human development and denies men and women the possibility of ever becoming free human beings. Now, it's true, of course, that a slave can become accustomed to his or her chains. That is true. Workers can become accustomed to living in bad housing, eating bad food, watching bad programs on television. Dare I say it, listening to awfully bad music. That is because they are enslaved to the humiliating division between mental and manual labor. And I'll come back to the historical origins of this if I have time later on. This idea, which has been present for thousands of years, that there are two kinds of people: those who think and know and command, and those who do not think at all, but only work and obey. To use the Bible's expression, the hewers of wood and the drawers of water. But the eruption of the masses on the stage of history, their active intervention in politics, that's the revolution, signifies a sharp break with so-called normal life. Men and women who are normally content to leave their individual destinies in the hands of other people, the so-called experts, the members of parliament, the councillors, the economists, the bureaucrats, the university professors, all those people who allegedly know best how to run society, suddenly decide that they will henceforth administer their own affairs and determine their own destinies. That is the essence of a revolution. Marx and Engels long ago explained that in any society where art, science, and government are the monopoly of a few, the latter will always use and abuse its privilege in its own interest. But the most typical manifestation of a revolution, as I've said, is precisely this thirst to know and to understand, and also to feel themselves as human beings and not slaves or animals. And this is where art becomes fused with revolution and becomes its very heart and soul. But first of all, there's a question that must be asked. Is art necessary? Now, some decades ago, the Austrian Marxist Ernst Fischer wrote a very interesting book called The Necessity of Art. I recommend that book. But is art really necessary? Most people would answer in the negative, I'm sure. I can understand that. If you enter most houses, you'll find probably paintings on the wall. Are these paintings necessary? Well, not really, because nobody ever looks at them. They might as well be there as not there. So therefore, they're not necessary. And yet, in a deeper sense, art has always played a very fundamental role in the development of our species. In fact, you might say that art serves to define what it is to be human. It's the existence of art which separates us from other species in the animal world. Now, that's not to say that there isn't some kind of aesthetic sense present in lower animals. For example, there's a bird called the bowerbird, which displays the most elaborate interest in designing a nest for the purpose of mating, for the purpose of attracting the opposite sex. So there is, you could argue that there's some aesthetic sense is present at least. And I noticed that recently, archaeological discoveries have revived interest in the theory that the Neanderthals possessed a kind of art that predates Homo sapiens sapiens by a long period of time. That may be the case. Yeah, but in all these cases, what we see is not developed art in any sense that we would understand it, but in any event, an embryonic anticipation, out of which real art could and did develop. The real origins of art can be traced to the cave art of the Paleolithic period, particularly in the spectacular paintings found in places like Lascaux in France and Altamira in Spain. If my memory serves me correctly, these remarkable paintings were made between 29,000 and 32,000 years ago. Now, this art tells us a lot about the people who made it, but there are many strange things about it also. For example, where would you expect this art to be found? Logically, it should be near the mouth of the cave where there's more daylight. That's the area where people would have lived, part of the time at least. Certainly not the dark and dangerous interior of the cave. But no, these paintings are always found in the deepest, most remote parts of the cave, very difficult to access. So whatever the purpose of this art was, it certainly was not a mere ornament. It was something profoundly important to the community at large. Now, just imagine for a moment, imagine the scene. A man or a woman, you don't know, because there is definite evidence that women also played the role of what is known as shamans, the equivalent of ritual priestesses, I suppose. This person crawling on their belly in complete darkness with only a flickering lamp of burning animal fat to light their way, struggling from darkness to light. Now, isn't that really striking? As a metaphor for the whole of human history, our constant struggle from darkness to light. And at the end of it, these unknown individuals, we don't know their names, but they may have people that excelled in certain skills, were capable of producing the most fabulous art. But what strikes one about this art is that it is essentially social and collective, not personal. And what about its content? That's an interesting point. The first thing to note is what we do not find. No trees, flowers or plants of any sort. Only animals, and not just any animals. The bulls, woolly rhinos, woolly mammoths, etc., These were the animals that were hunted for food to keep the people alive. And these animals are depicted with great skill, tremendous skill, obviously painted by people with an intimate knowledge of their anatomy. I would actually say that in their amazing realism, these paintings of animals have never really been improved upon. If I remember correctly, Picasso said, seeing these things, he said, well, we have nothing to teach them. But there's another strange absence here, isn't there? No human beings, or hardly any. Those that appear are carelessly painted, like a child's picture of matchstick men. Now, that's obviously not a lack of skill. It was because they weren't seen as important. There is an exception, of course, a mysterious figure which seems to be human, but he appears to be wearing an animal headdress. Probably, as I say, a shaman, one of these wizards or priests or whatever. Now, and probably what this art represents is sympathetic magic. That's one of the earliest forms of religion, in which men and women tried to gain control over their environment through a series of rituals. Clearly, these paintings played a role in these rituals, probably accompanied with dancing and music or drums or whatever. That, of course, has been lost. We can only imagine that. But this was definitely religion involving the whole community. Organized religion was unknown. That came later, in the period which we will now consider, which is known as the Neolithic period. Now, the great Australian archaeologist Gordon Childe, by the way, he was a Marxist. Not many people know that. And he wrote some very good books, which I recommend. One of them is What Happened in History, and the other is Man Makes Himself, which is a phrase from Marx, by the way. It was Gordon Childe who invented the expression, the Neolithic Revolution. This was arguably the greatest revolution in history. It represents, on the one hand, the transition from simple hunter-gathering societies, which is of the Paleolithic type, to a more complex form of society based on farming. This great revolution began in the Middle East about 10,000 years or 12,000 years ago. And as I say, represents a tremendous revolution in human society and culture. You see, the rise of agriculture forced men and women to try to understand nature more. And the advances of the productive forces, if you like, actually permitted men and women to conquer and subdue the forces of nature in practice through the application of collective labor on a grand scale. The new conditions of production gave men and women more time for more complex analytical thought, to contemplate the workings of nature, to follow the movement of the stars and planets. And the mysteries of life and death appeared to men's minds in a different light. So on the one hand, it was a huge advance, but it also represented an enormous step back when the old equalitarian communistic society was overthrown by private property and the division of societies into classes. But nevertheless, it was this division between mental and manual labor that permitted a colossal development of culture, of science, of art, of architecture, the pyramids. Yeah, and it was Aristotle who wrote in the Metaphysics a profoundly materialistic explanation of culture. He wrote in the Metaphysics, man begins to philosophize when the needs of life are provided. Consequently, astronomy and mathematics were discovered in Egypt because the priests did not have to work. Simple as that. And that's been the case for the last 10,000 years. Now, here we have the first great instance of alienation. Man's essence is alienated. I'm using the masculine, but I think it refers to men or women, doesn't matter. Human beings, if you like, the human essence is alienated in a double or triple sense. First of all, private property signifies the alienation of one's product, which is appropriated by another. Secondly, the individual's control over life and destiny is appropriated by the state, which appears for the first time, ultimately in the person of the king or pharaoh. And last but not least, Alienation is carried over from this life to the next. The inner being, the soul, as it was known, is appropriated by, of all men and women, is appropriated by the deities of the next world, whose goodwill must be constantly obtained. It must be obtained constantly through prayers and sacrifice. And here we have the origin of organized religion for the first time. The priest caste possessed a monopoly of knowledge and of power, just as the services of the monarch form the basis of the wealth of the upper class, of mandarins and nobles, so the sacrifices to the gods form the basis of the wealth and power of the priest caste that interposes itself between the people and the gods and goddesses. Now, all of this finds its reflection in art. Let's take Egyptian art as a clearest example. I should add, of course, here at this point, that great art is by no means confined to Europe. Egypt is not in Europe, it's in Africa. And of course, you have great art in India and Cambodia and other parts of Asia, which displayed tremendous energy, exuberance, and vitality. China and Japan have produced great masterpieces like of watercolors, for example, of natural scenes, but that have never been equaled, in my view. And let's not forget that it was the Arabs in Spain who kept the lamp of learning burning when the rest of Europe was plunged into spiritual blackness of the Dark Ages after the fall of the Roman Empire. The great achievements of the East, unfortunately, fall outside the scope of the present lecture. But we must not forget that it was the Middle East where civilization was born. There could be no Greek art without Egyptian and Babylonian art, and no Greek science without Egyptian and Babylonian science. Now, Egyptian art speaks to us, you know. It's an art with a message, a very clear and obvious message. If you come to London and you go to the British Museum, you will find in one of the Egyptian rooms the fragments of a gigantic statue of a pharaoh. I forgot which one, maybe Ramesses II, I don't remember. But just the forearm alone is considerably bigger than a man's body. What's the message of this art? It's speaking to us. It says, I am big, you are small. I am all powerful, you are weak and impotent. I am everything, you are nothing. And the same message, by the way, has been repeated many times in the history of art. Now, I'd like to speak more on Egyptian art, but I don't have time. Just to skate over. Egyptian art achieved many remarkable things, it's true. But there is something lacking in it. To take the statues, for instance. They're extremely kind of stiff and lifeless. And almost all of them, you've got the body of a human being and the head of an animal or a bird. So this is art which has not yet attained the level of true humanity. And it didn't change much. There were some changes, but it didn't change fundamentally for thousands of years. Why? Because this is not free art. It's entirely bound by the fetters of religion, by the priest caste. Now, with Greek art, of course, we suddenly find ourselves that we feel more at home, shall we say. Look at these wonderful statues of the human form. Again, I think it's never been surpassed. Possibly in the Renaissance, they came close to it. But the rigidity of the Egyptian statues has disappeared altogether. And for the first time, we are left face to face with the human form, the human body, in all its naked glory. The cult of the human body here, by the way, begins with the male form, and that's not an accident. This was a warrior society, as you find in the writings of Homer, in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And therefore, the cult of the warrior was paramount. In the National Museum in Athens, in Greece, there's a remarkable statue of Poseidon, the sea god. He's in the act of throwing a spear, or perhaps it was a trident. This statue is so alive. The tension in the muscles, the balance, the extreme concentration is so perfectly captured that you think it was alive. In these marvelous statues, we see the contours of every muscle, every bone, indicating that the Greeks had a very exact idea of human anatomy. And yet, if you think about it, this art also cannot be properly described as realistic. I wish I had a body like that. Yeah, so does Anna. That's another matter. Change the subject. But what it really represents is an idealization of the male body. It corresponds to the rise of idealism in Greek philosophy. This was a period of war, civil strife, and also revolution. In Athens, above all, that one tyrant succeeded another until the revolution of 508 BC, the first recorded popular revolution in history. And following this revolution, Athens blossomed. Its culture and art underwent a renaissance based upon economic prosperity, which is the real basis of Athenian power. But I don't have time to deal with this at any length. This is art that breathes a new spirit, the spirit of Athenian democracy. But we must never forget that the basis of this art was slavery. Athens was a wonderful democracy for the free population. Yes, but it wasn't so for the slaves or for women who also had no rights. And the fact that all of culture is based on slavery, that's always been the case of art and culture in general. If you come to Roman art, well, Roman art is heavily dependent on Greek art. I don't think it really made any original contribution, except that it did develop a certain realism later on in the Republic. But the fall of the Roman Empire undoubtedly signified a colossal retrogression of culture at all levels. In saying this, I'm well aware that this view is no longer fashionable due to the postmodernist mania that is sweeping academia, which persists in telling us that there's no such thing as progress, and that one society is just as good as another. Well, I think the historical record definitely speaks against them. And this is easy to explain from a Marxist point of view. Culture has a material base. And if you destroy the material base, you destroy culture, simple as that. I mean, they're trying to revive the Dark Ages now. The Dark Ages was a great time to be alive, according to these nitwits. Look at the Vikings. They had very nice jewelry and very clever ships. They also had very sharp swords and battle axes for cutting people in two. But there we are. Nice people. What's the meaning of this praise of barbarism? It's become the mode, the habit. It's the fashion to praise barbarism. Well, I think we're heading for barbarism now, so I suppose they're just getting us ready for it. What a load of nonsense, for God's sake. Look, I'll just give you one example. That's sufficient. I won't waste time on this nonsense. 1,000 years after the fall of the Roman Empire, the only half-decent roads in Europe were Roman roads. The art of road building had been lost, along with most of the other arts. And it was the Dark Ages, no two ways about it, from which eventually emerged feudal society, which destroyed all the glorious achievements of the ancient world and submitted us to the tyranny of the Roman Catholic Church for 1,000 years. Throughout the Middle Ages, all cultural life was dominated by the dictatorship of the church. The proper subject of art was God, not man, and least of all women, who were regarded as the source of all evil. Oh, yes. Yeah, original sin. The great cathedrals that dominated the landscape were constructed in the same way as the Egyptian pyramids and so on, to emphasize the smallness and insignificance of real men and women. You enter into these dark buildings where the only light comes from stained glass windows depicting the lives and torments of saints and martyrs. And the soaring towers, the vaults, direct your eyes upwards, away from this sinful world and towards heaven. Now, this was a very dark period indeed, in which human beings were taught to despise the real world, despise their flesh, despise their bodies, despise sex, and dedicate all their lives to one thing, death. But even here, even in this cultural desert, there was gradually a new spirit began to penetrate this world. You see it in art. For the first time, you see the Virgin Mary holding a real baby. And that's not an accident. It was a period in which the church already was in crisis. And by the end of the Middle Ages, it was hated, frankly. I quote, a Catholic historian notes, as a revolutionary spirit of hatred of the church and the clergy has taken hold of the masses in various parts of Germany. The cry, death to the priests, which had long been whispered in secret, was now the slogan of the day. And of course, this culminated in the great schism provoked by Martin Luther. That was a revolution. The Reformation was a revolution, a bourgeois revolution. It reflects the rise of a new middle class, the bourgeoisie in the cities and towns. Luther himself played a great cultural role. Translated the Bible into German. He wrote hymns which were revolutionary songs, actually. The greatest one, of course, was Ein feste Burg, a strong fortress, which Engels described as the Marseillaise of the 16th century. And part of this rise of the bourgeois of a new class was a new spirit called the Renaissance, which means the rebirth. Again, I would like to speak at length, but it's not possible. From about 1420, it became the art becomes more realistic. The faces are recognizable individuals. It is a spirit of a new age, a bourgeois age, the age of the individual. It was a genuine revolution in art. First of all, in Italy and Flanders. I can't go into the details, but you had works of genius. And when Constantinople, which is the last, the remnant of the Roman Empire, when it was overturned by the Ottoman Turks in 1453, there was a flood of statues and manuscripts which came, and documents and manuscripts of all sorts, which transformed the art world. It revolutionized painting and sculpture with the great works of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and others. Now, it's interesting to note, one of the high points of the Renaissance took place in the Netherlands. And people don't realize that the first bourgeois revolution didn't take place in England, it took place in Holland. It took the form of a war of national liberation of the Dutch Protestants against Catholic Spain. It's a very violent and bloody affair. But the victory of Holland meant the victory of the bourgeois revolution, which again led to a revolution in art. Look, put it this way. Only in 17th century Holland could a miller's son aspire to become a famous painter. Rembrandt's father was a miller. His brothers were a baker and a shoemaker. So you have this great art coming from the Netherlands. Then you had the English Revolution, of course, which warrants a separate subject, which had, of course, the great poet John Milton, the author of Paradise Lost, who was not just a great poet, he was also an active revolutionary, a member of Cromwell's revolutionary government. But of course, in many parts of Europe, there hadn't yet been a bourgeois revolution. You had the absolute monarchies, especially in France, the monarchy of Louis XIV. And that had its own art. You see, art always reflects the existing society one way or the other. That was classicism, a very kind of rigid, stylized form of art. Absolutism imposed rigid rules on everything, even on nature. You know, the comrades, if you've been to France, perhaps you've visited the gardens of Versailles. That's the court of Louis XIV. What do you notice about these gardens? Geometry, straight lines. But there are no straight lines in nature. And what these vast gardens with their fountains and their statues, what they're saying to us is, we are so powerful, we can control nature. That's what they thought. But unfortunately, they were mistaken. And the whole thing was overthrown, blown apart by one of the greatest revolutions in history, the French Revolution. Now, that again would be a subject in and of itself. But the French Revolution opened a whole new vista for human culture, not just in France. not just in art, but in literature, in poetry, in music. It had a big effect on someone like Beethoven, for example. And in general, it was the beginning of the Romantic movement then in the 19th century, which I haven't got time to go into. Oh, by the way, you know, Wagner has got a very bad name. I'm sure that John McAnally wants to speak on this. I don't know if he'll have time. When somebody mentions the word Wagner, what do you think of immediately? You think of Hitler and the Nazis, don't you? Poor Wagner. It's not his fault that Wagner liked his operas. Now I'll surprise you. Would it surprise you to know? Would it surprise you to know that Wagner was a personal friend of the anarchist Bakunin, very much under Bakunin's influence? That he wrote a work called Art and Revolution, in which he declares himself to be a follower of Feuerbach. That's it, Feuerbach. And Wagner personally participated in the uprising in Dresden in 1849 and had to flee for his life. There were a lot of artists and poets and musicians at that time that were very sympathetic to the revolution. But it's always the same with the intellectuals, you know, with a few exceptions. That when the revolution ebbs, they become depressed and they withdraw into themselves. I don't have a great deal of time left. I'm rushing here. But you know, revolution, Trotsky said, is the locomotive of history. Nowadays, of course, it's fashionable for all these bourgeois, these scoundrels, to portray the Bolsheviks as bloodthirsty monsters bent on the destruction of all civilization and human values. That's entirely false. That's a lie. The Bolshevik Revolution was the greatest single event in human history. It emancipated millions of people, not just the workers and peasants, but it attracted the best elements among the intelligentsia, the artists, and so on. They were drawn to the revolution. And far from being a totalitarian wilderness, which is what they tried to portray, revolutionary Russia was buzzing with excitement, with all kinds of schools of art, literature, and music contending with each other. Wonderful composers like Dmitri Shostakovich and many others. The theaters and opera houses were full of workers and soldiers, eagerly drinking in a culture in a world which was completely unknown to them. The poetry of Mayakovsky, who was a member of the Bolshevik Party, by the way, and also his posters, played a significant role in the revolution. Later on, he committed suicide to protest against the encroachments of the Stalinist bureaucracy, which suffocated art, just as it suffocated Soviet democracy itself. Now, it goes without saying, by the way, that totalitarianism and bureaucracy are entirely destructive of art. The suicide of Mayakovsky in 1930 marks a turning point, and his suicide note was the tragic epitaph on the tomb of revolutionary art. Incidentally, Trotsky was the Marxist theoretician who showed the greatest interest in art. And a couple of years before he was murdered, in a very critical stage of the world revolution, he joined together with the French surrealist writer André Breton to write a revolutionary manifesto for the freedom of art. Now, why you think Trotsky was wasting his time doing this? Can you not see that this great Marxist understood the necessity of a revolutionary approach to art? And of course, it's in our interest to win over the best of the intellectuals, the best of the artists. Of course, it's in our interest. But we can't expect them to be interested in our ideas if we don't express an interest in their ideas. But what about art today? Let's begin to draw the threads together. I'm sorry if you feel a little bit dizzy about this rapid tour from the Paleolithic to modern times, but there you are. Now, as I've explained, in its youth, in its revolutionary period, the bourgeoisie played a progressive role in pushing back the horizons of human culture. What's the position now? In the period of senile decay of capitalism, the bourgeoisie is engaged in the wholesale destruction of culture. Its entire being is centered on money grubbing in its narrowest and most repulsive sense. A poverty of ideas, a total lack of any originality and content, capable of producing only a sense of tedium and disgust in any minimally cultivated mind. Oh yes, Big business gives the public what it wants. That's what they say. In reality, capital gives the public what it thinks that they should have. A steady diet of rubbish, sex, sport, scandal, with a minimum of politics and culture. A diet that's neatly tailored to the requirements of the bankers and capitalists. It's the modern equivalent of bread and circuses of the Romans, except there's not much bread, it seems. But even in a slave society, bread alone was never sufficient to keep the masses in a state of obedient stupor. And art today has become reduced to the level of a mere commodity. More than that, the artists themselves have been reduced to mere commodities. You know, the wonderful painter Vincent van Gogh never sold a single painting during his lifetime. And he died in abject poverty, as did Van Vermeer and others like him, many, many others. Now, of course, these paintings, if you can get hold of them, will sell for astronomical sums. I was watching a terrible program on the TV the other night, and the figure emerged that the art market, that's what they call it, the art market, now has a total value estimated at $56 billion. With such profits to be made from art, why should anyone in their right mind bother with productive investment? The so-called art market is only an extreme manifestation of the parasitic nature of capitalism in its phase of decay. Hundreds of millions of dollars are spent on rubbish, actually. These insane sums of money bear absolutely no relation to the intrinsic artistic value of the works on sale. They are objects of speculation, neither more nor less. And most of them end up locked up in the vaults of banks, never to be seen. Of course, quite a few of them lose nothing by remaining unseen, since their artistic value is nil. Like the works of the American pop artist Jeff Koons. Typical of his work is a statue called Michael Jackson and Bubbles. And it depicts the pop singer together in the company of a monkey. The initial purchase price of this masterpiece in 1991 was a mere $250,000. It was later sold on for $5.6 million. Now it would sell probably for twice or three times that amount. In my opinion, if the entire production of Mr. Koons were to be locked up in a vault forever, it wouldn't be a loss to anybody. But among the works of art thus disposed of are some real treasures of world art. In this way, the human race is being robbed of a precious part of our heritage. Now, some years ago, I wrote an article in which I said the following: great art must be the voice of suffering humanity. I stand by that. I firmly believe that great art must have something important to say, like the wonderful work of Pablo Picasso, Guernica. This is an astounding work of art, a cry from the heart, a shattering denunciation of the cruelty of war and fascist barbarism. Lenin said that capitalism was horror without end. And with all the horrors and sufferings that the human race is suffering today, what has art got to say about it? Where can one find the equivalent of Goya's Disasters of War or his Black Period? Nowhere. Instead, we have what? An unmade bed or a shark in formaldehyde. We know what Picasso's Guernica represents. And we know what Goya's work represents. What does a shark in formaldehyde represent? It represents a shark in formaldehyde, neither more nor less. Such is the blind alley of spiritual emptiness and artistic triviality into which the senile degeneration of capitalism has plunged the human race. You know, I think it was Engels who said that any society in which art, science, and government are in the hands of a few, that few will abuse its position in order to establish a cultural, political, and moral dictatorship over the rest of society. Art and science require freedom in order to develop, complete freedom. Art must oppose the yoke of tyranny in all its forms, not just the policeman with his baton and his handcuffs, but not only the soulless bureaucrat with his rule book in his hand, or the spiritual policeman of the church, but also the dictatorship of capital which is the mother and father of all forms of oppression, both material and spiritual. Real art, comrades, is always revolutionary by its very nature. In the 18th century, the road to the great French Revolution was prepared by the Enlightenment. In just the same way, the road to the Socialist Revolution will be paved by a struggle to defend the conquests of art and culture against the threat posed by the decay of the degeneration of capitalism. Only when society breaks the suffocating stranglehold of rent, interest, and profit will the material conditions be created for the attainment of genuine freedom, for the free development of human beings. Therefore, the revolutionary struggle against capitalism is at the same time a remorseless struggle against capitalist degeneration and in defense of human civilization and its highest and most noble manifestation, art and culture.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Alan. So I'm going to ask Nelson to come into the discussion now.
Comrades, I'd like to make a contribution about theatre in the Russian Revolution. After the October Revolution, there was for the first time in the history of Russia a free and open participation of ordinary people in art. Theatre was arguably the largest expression of this. In the late 19th century, theatre was in decline in Russia. Up to 1882, the theatre was an imperial monopoly under the Tsar, where all professional ballet, opera, and drama had to be staged in one of the Tsar's own theatres. Even after this, artistic mediocrity prevailed. The brilliant theatres like the Moscow Art Theatre were still unable to provide theatre for the masses because of cost and also due to censorship. The Russian Revolution changed all of this. After 1917, hundreds of theatre groups sprang up all across Russia, often connected to local factories and villages. The Bolsheviks organized and subsidized theatre companies and set up schools in theatre. Most Russian people had no experience of the theatre, so the Bolsheviks tried to make it as accessible as possible. Other spectacles included the special dramas of the revolutions of 1848 and 1917, the Paris Commune, or Spartacus's slave uprising. One of the most famous of these was the storming of the Winter Palace, where there were over 8,000 participants and an orchestra of at least 500, included many who were actually involved in the real event. One of the most important figures during this period was Konstantin Stanislavski. Stanislavski is mostly known for creating his system, which is today known as method acting. Stanislavski, in effect, discovered the scientific laws of acting. But what is not widely known is that Stanislavski was a supporter of the Russian Revolution and saw it as a way of finally bringing art to the masses, which bourgeois society had withheld from them. He originally wanted his Moscow Art Theatre to be a popular theatre, accessible to workers. But Stanislavski was not a member of the Bolshevik Party. He had no knowledge of Marxist theory. In fact, when Lunacharsky invited him to be part of the Bolshevik government, he politely declined. I quote Stanislavski on 1917. There thundered about us the second revolution, and after it the third, all in 1917. The theatre added a new mission to its work. It was to open its doors to the widest masses of spectators, to those millions of people who until that time had no opportunity to enjoy cultural delights. For some time after the revolution, the public in the theatre was mixed. It was poor and rich, intelligent and non-intelligent, teachers, students, coachmen, janitors, clerks, street cleaners, soldiers. These people came to the theatre not to be amused, but in order to learn. I remember one peasant who came once a year to Moscow to see the entire repertoire of our theatre. He would redden and pale from excitement and enthusiasm. And when the play ended, he could not return home to sleep. He walked alone for hours in the streets in order to clarify his impressions. Having seen our entire repertoire, he would write numerous philosophical letters, which helped him to digest and live over these impressions. End quote. Comrades, this is what a revolution is all about. In revolution, the masses move into the spotlight of history and begin to run and organize society in their own interests. In doing so, they begin to express themselves as human beings for the first time. The need for art is an essential part of this striving of the human spirit. The quote continues, "Then came October. The doors of our theatre opened exclusively for the poor people. Our performances were free to all those who received their tickets from the factories where we sent them. Many classes passed through our theatre. They came not by accident, but with trembling and the expectation of something important, something they had never experienced before. End quote. Contrary to what the bourgeois try and argue, the Bolsheviks did not clamp down on artistic freedom. Lenin, who had been visiting the Moscow Art Theatre from as early as 1901, and the other leading Bolsheviks guaranteed artistic freedom because they understood that they had to preserve and build on the greatest achievements of the old society. So they stepped in to preserve the Moscow Art Theatre and the other imperial theatres. And they insisted on maintaining classical repertoires. Lenin personally intervened to save Stanislavski from destitution. So if the Bolsheviks nationalized the theatres to spread communist propaganda, as the bourgeois argue, why then did these theatres after 1917 produce Chekhov, Dostoevsky, Pushkin, Schiller, and the other classics? It is laughable to suggest that this is Bolshevik propaganda. Stanislavski himself said in 1928, "Our government did not force us to dye ourselves red and pretend to be what we were not. Socialism must base itself on the highest existing forms of art and culture, as Trotsky explains. The point of revolution is not to create proletarian art, as some thought, but to lay the foundations for socialist art, free from the poisonous influence of ego, individualism, and profit. This will be the first truly human culture." The Moscow Art Theatre became world-renowned following 1917, and others like Meyerhold made huge steps forward for the theatre. But the Stalinist counter-revolution also led to counter-revolution in the arts. And the creativity of figures like Stanislavski was eventually crushed and replaced with socialist realism, the antithesis of genuine art. That so much was achieved in Russian theatre in such a short space of time is a testament to the power of revolution and the creativity of the masses, which now exist as untapped potential. Comrades, it is our task to make this potential a reality, to bring about the revolution in art by bringing about the revolution in society. It is the only thing that can finally set art and creativity free from the shackles of capitalism and usher in a new golden age of artistic freedom and genuine human expression. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nelson. A superb contribution to the discussion. Welcome back, comrades, to the session on Marxism and art. Our first speaker now will be Adam Pal.
In the Indian subcontinent, art has played a key role in spreading the ideas of revolutionary socialism to the wider layer of masses. In India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and other countries of South Asia, art is an integral part of revolutionary politics. Music, poetry, theater, and all other forms of art have helped the revolutionaries to take their message to the factory workers, peasants, and all the oppressed layers of society. Comrades of IMT here are also following this tradition and are organizing street theaters, musical gatherings, and poetry recitals to spread our message. Across this whole region, in every meeting, protest, demonstration, or strike, revolutionary songs, poetry, and other forms of art are always used to raise the morale of the participants and to spread the revolutionary message. Revolutionary poets like Qazi Nazrul Islam in Bengal and Faiz Ahmed Faiz in Urdu Hindi belt in northern India and Pakistan have become popular and are revered by tens of millions, cutting across artificial boundaries and nationalities. Habib Jalib from Pakistan, Sahir Ludhianvi from India, and many other poets and singers and artists are popular among revolutionaries across the subcontinent, and their arts are, or songs and poems are still the battle cry in many mass movements erupting in different parts of this region. Bhagat Singh was a revolutionary who was hanged to death in 1931 by British imperialism for his struggle for a socialist society. When he was being taken to the gallows along with his two other comrades, he was singing a revolutionary song, which was written by another revolutionary poet named Bismil. And this song is still reverberated across the Indian subcontinent. So Bhagat Singh was martyred at the age of 23, almost a century ago. But the song he sang and the emotions he infused in that revolutionary poetry is still reverberating across the whole subcontinent, and tens of millions across the subcontinent sing those songs still today. Opening lines of that song say that we are ready to lay our lives for our cause, but we will test the power of the oppressor if he can stop our ideas and struggle. Music, poetry, theater have very rich traditions in this part of the world, and for thousands of years, people have been developing these forms of art towards perfection. Music is, for example, a special form of art which uses human voice and sounds of instruments as its medium to convey the feelings. In painting, colors and canvas is used. In architecture, stones and other materials are used to carve out a beautiful structure. In poetry, words and rhythm is used to convey the emotions and feelings. In fiction, writer develops characters, but in music, only the variations of human voice is the medium which grips the imagination of the listener without use of any words or character or canvas. Indian classical music developed this art of music towards perfection, where musicians developed special patterns of notes and microtones called rags, which, when rendered artfully, would develop particular emotions in the listener without use of any words or poetry. A rag with a set pattern of musical notes arouses a feeling of melancholy or joy or sadness or enthusiasm if sung properly by an artist. And for hundreds of years, court musicians have been developing this art. These court musicians in various parts of this region developed these rags to entertain the rajas, the kings or queens, and other peoples of nobility. On the other hand, for the masses, there was the tradition of folk music and poetry in which the movements of resistance were told to the audience and transferred to the next generations. The heroic struggles of women against customs and traditions and other rebels and the struggles for emancipation were told as folk tales and sung in festivals and wedding ceremonies with traditional instruments. With the advent of capitalism in India in the 18th and 19th century, under the boot of British imperialism, this whole structure was transformed. The whole society was transformed from top to bottom. And this had huge impacts on art, and court musicians, poets, painters, architects, and all other artists were penniless and had to face extreme poverty and destitution. And Marx and Engels explained this in the manifesto that capitalism has destroyed the prestige of all professions like that of a poet and a teacher and have made them paid wage laborers. The plight of artists in 19th and 20th century India explains these words graphically. The whole life of Mirza Ghalib, a 19th century great Urdu poet, is a manifestation of these lines written by Marx and Engels in 1848. The impact of Russian Revolution in 1970s was huge across India. It also deeply affected the artists of every genre. Revolutionary poets like Faiz revolted against the traditional themes of Urdu poetry like romance, love, and wine in an artistic way and transformed them into revolutionary symbols. Faiz also used religious themes commonly understood to explain the revolutionary message. In one of his poems named We Will See, he transformed the religious theme of the day of judgment as the day of revolution, the day when thrones will be overturned and crowns will fly, when mountains of oppression will burst apart into tiny particles and masses will rule everywhere. This poem became popular when legendary female singer Iqbal Bano sang it in a meeting of revolutionaries in Lahore during the dictatorship of General Zia. The composition of the poem is beautiful, and the beat of the song rises to the fastest level when the lines about the judgment day or the day of revolution are sung. There is an outpouring of revolutionary slogan whenever this song is rendered in our meetings and conference. And some years ago, it was the anthem of the huge mass movement in India centered in Delhi against the Citizenship Act. Revolutionaries in Pakistan facing the dictatorships of General Zia or General Ayub used to sing these revolutionary songs when facing brutal torture, when security officials were torturing them in dungeons and hanging them on gallows, while on their lips there were songs of revolution and the glory of martyrdom. We vow to carry forward these marvelous traditions and will face all the hardships thrown upon us from the ruling class. We will face all these hardships with a smile and will march forward on the tune of revolutionary music. And new poets and new singers and musicians will emerge out of the revolutionary movements in the future and will write and songs much more revolutionary and radical and will rule the hearts of millions of people across the region.
Thank you so much, Adam. That was fascinating and really inspiring. So next we will have Carlos Che from Mexico.
La revolución rusa de 1917 tuvo que lidiar con un colosal atraso cultural.
The Russian Revolution of 1917 had to deal with a colossal cultural backwardness.
En medio de ello floreció una galaxia de artistas y talentos. La sociedad dio lo mejor de sí.
In the middle of this flourished a galaxy of artists and talents. Society gave the best of itself.
Vimos el florecer de distintas vanguardias artísticas en todas las áreas.
We saw in all aspects of art, new and distinct artistic vanguards were flourishing.
El cine, que alcanzó muy poco desarrollo bajo el zarismo, se elevaría a grandes alturas.
Cinema, which achieved very low heights under Tsarism, was elevated to great heights.
La Rusia, gobernada por los obreros, creó la primera escuela de cine de todo el planeta.
Russia, governed by the workers, created the first cinema school in the whole planet.
No se tenía a veces ni para comprar película virgen. Aún así, se empezaron a hacer los primeros aportes de la mano de Lev Kuleshov.
They didn't even sometimes have money in order to buy new tape, new reel, but they still began with the first contributions from the hand of Lev Kuleshov.
Hasta entonces, el cine había desarrollado un lenguaje, pero hasta cierto punto lineal.
Since then, cinema has developed in a language in the world, but has followed a certain lineal structure.
La Revolución Rusa le dotó de una gran aportación indispensable hasta nuestros días, el montaje cinematográfico.
The Russian Revolution has given us a great contribution to cinematic language, which is indispensable in our days, in nowadays, which is this cinematographic montage.
El montaje consiste en ordenar distintos planos aparentemente disociados entre sí.
Montage consists in organizing different planes, different screens, apparently unassociated between each one.
Pero que unidos dan una forma concreta y determinan un sentido y generan un efecto dramático determinado.
But when you put them together in a concrete form, they determine a certain sense and they generate a dramatic effect.
En realidad, esto fue una contribución colectiva de los cineastas soviéticos.
In reality, this was a collective contribution from the cinema makers of Russia.
Eran los años de la Guerra Civil. El Ejército Rojo fue una importante cuna del cine.
In the years of the Civil War, the Red Army contributed to cinema.
Además de librar la guerra en el frente de batalla, se libraba una guerra cinematográfica.
As well as carrying out the war on the front, they also carried out a cinematic war.
Los imperialistas hacían una campaña con documentales, reportajes, atacando a los comunistas. La revolución respondió.
The imperialists launched a campaign of documentaries and reports attacking the communists. The revolution responded.
Un grupo de camarógrafos llamados Kinoks arriesgaban sus vidas filmando escenas del frente de batalla. Tenían la consigna filmar o morir.
A group of photographers called Kinoks risked their lives filming scenes from the battlefront. They had the slogan, film or die.
Siga Bertov recibía estos materiales de distintas zonas del frente de batalla y con eso armaba reportajes.
Ziga Vertov received these materials from different areas of the front, of the military front, and with them he created reports.
Estos reportajes se llamaban Kino Pravda, Cine Verdad, y desarrollaron también el montaje cinematográfico.
These reports were called Kino Pravda, True Cinema, and they were developed through montage as well.
Lenin dijo en 1922, de todas las artes, el cine es para nosotros la más importante. El cine debe ser y será el principal instrumento de cultura del proletariado.
Lenin said in 1922, of all the arts, cinema is for us the most important. Cinema should be and will be the main instrument of culture of the working class.
En medio de la lucha contra el atraso cultural y contra el imperialismo, la revolución proletaria usaba el cine como importante herramienta.
In the midst of the fight against the cultural backwardness and imperialism, the workers' revolution, the cinema was an important tool in this struggle.
Se usaban coloridos trenes que recorrían el país adaptados con salas de cine.
They used painted trains that ran across the whole country that had been adapted to have cinema rooms in them.
Todo esto se hacía en un ambiente de plena libertad.
This was all done in an atmosphere of complete freedom.
Trotsky señaló que no era labor del partido determinar el contenido del arte.
Trotsky indicated that it wasn't the work of the party to determine the contents of art.
Cosa distinta era cuando artistas hacían acciones contrarrevolucionarias. La revolución se tenía que defender.
It was only different in the case when artists made counter-revolutionary art attacking the revolution.
Eisenstein es el más importante cineasta que generó la Revolución de Octubre.
Eisenstein was the most important cinematographer that the revolution created.
Su película El acorazado Potemkin es una de las más grandes obras de la cinematografía mundial.
His major work, The Battleship Potemkin, is one of the most important pieces of cinema in the whole world, in the history of cinema.
La Rusia revolucionaria, que heredó un importante atraso, mostró al mundo que era capaz de conseguir colosales logros, no solo en la economía, sino también en el arte.
The Russian Revolution, which had inherited such an important, such a deep amount of backwardness, showed to the whole world that it was capable of achieving great things, not only in economy, but also in art.
La gran desgracia del arte y el cine soviético es que cuando comenzaban a florecer, iniciaba la contrarrevolución burocrática, el estalinismo.
The great shame of art, of cinema and art in the Soviet Union is when it started to flourish, the bureaucratic counter-revolution also began, Stalinism.
Eisenstein hizo una película sobre la Revolución de Octubre, pero su principal protagonista era Trotsky.
Eisenstein made a film about the Russian Revolution with Trotsky as his protagonist.
Bajo la presión de la burocracia tuvo que cambiar su película, aunque no eliminó del todo a Trotsky.
Under the pressure of the bureaucracy, he had to adapt his film, but he didn't completely get rid of Trotsky.
La burocracia aplastó las vanguardias artísticas. Esta repele a la revolución.
The bureaucracy repelled the revolution.
Si los artistas habían puesto sus talentos a favor de la causa, ahora la burocracia dictaba lo que tenían que decir.
If the artists had put themselves and their arts towards the strength of the revolution, now the bureaucracy was telling them what to do.
Los artistas, como un genio como Eisenstein, fueron censurados y tenían que adaptarse a los cánones del realismo socialista.
Artists and geniuses like Eisenstein were censored, and they were forced to make movies under socialist realism.
Eisenstein logró salir por un periodo del país, aunque no logró conseguir ninguna película, no pudo filmar ninguna película.
Eisenstein managed to get out of the country for a time, but he wasn't able to film anything.
Bueno, estuvo en Hollywood y ahí intentó hacer una película sobre el capital de Marx.
Actually, he was in Hollywood and he tried to make a film about Marx's Capital.
En Estados Unidos dijo que el cine estaba dominado por el dólar.
In the US, they say that cinema is dominated by the dollar.
Que en vez de afectar las cabezas y los corazones de las personas, actuaba en beneficio de 2 o 3 bolsillos.
Saying that instead of affecting the hearts and minds of the people, it went towards the profits of 2 or 3 pockets.
Es una muestra clara de que hay que liberar al arte del capitalismo.
It's a clear example that you have to free art from capitalism.
Bueno, en México intentó hacer otra película, la filmó, pero nunca la pudo montar.
In Mexico, Eisenstein tried to make another film. He managed to film everything, but he could never put it together.
Eisenstein es un producto claro de la Revolución de Octubre. Sus ideas políticas y cinematográficas no compaginaron con las producciones cinematográficas capitalistas ni con el estalinismo.
Eisenstein is a clear product of the October Revolution. His political ideas and his cinematography do not combine with the cinematographic productions of capitalism nor Stalinism.
Pero en 1932 todavía vimos un episodio glorioso del cine soviético.
But in 1932, we still had an episode, a moment of great Soviet cinema.
Un viejo general del Ejército Rojo quiso abandonar la carrera militar para hacer cine.
An old general from the Red Army wanted to abandon his military career to make movies.
Su nombre era Alexander Medvedkin.
His name was Alexander Medvedkin.
Su decisión no fue una claudicación política.
His decision wasn't a political statement.
En el comité central del partido se aprobó darle un cinetren, pero luego no se ejerció gran control burocrático sobre de él.
In the Central Committee of the Communist Party, they approved giving Medvedkin a cinema train, but then the bureaucracy exerted great force onto him.
Medvedkin y su grupo se lanzaron a los pueblos con la consigna filmar hoy, proyectar mañana.
Medvedkin and his group launched themselves towards the people with the slogan of film today, project the film tomorrow.
Los protagonistas de estas películas eran los habitantes de los pueblos y los trabajadores de las fábricas.
The protagonists of these movies were the inhabitants of the towns and workers in the factories.
La gente iba a ver las películas por curiosidad, pero a ver el contenido crítico, estas funciones terminaban comúnmente en asambleas.
The people went to see the movies out of curiosity, but when the movies, when they saw the critical content of these films, the filming at the end of the projection of the movie normally ended in assemblies.
Se aprobaban decretos, se destituía burócratas.
They approved decrees and they got rid of bureaucrats.
En algunas fábricas, incluso después de esto, se establecía el control obrero de la producción.
Also, in some factories, they established workers' control.
Los tripulantes del cinetren no eran artistas pequeñoburgueses buscando aventuras.
The crews of these cinema trains weren't petty bourgeois artists looking for adventure.
Eran bolcheviques comprometidos con la causa del socialismo y críticos a la burocracia.
They were Bolsheviks dedicated to the struggle for socialism and the fight against bureaucratism.
No fue fácil apagar la tradición de octubre. Tuvieron que venir masivos asesinatos. Artistas fueron víctimas también de las purgas.
It wasn't easy to get rid of the tradition of October. They had to carry out great lengths of mass assassinations, and many artists were victims in this purge.
Hoy nuestra vida está llena de imágenes. La batalla en video se ha cambiado de forma, pero sigue siendo un espacio para la batalla de la lucha de clases.
Today, our life is full of images. The battle of video content has changed its form, but it continues to be a battleground in the class struggle.
Las lecciones de la Revolución Rusa, también en el cine, pueden ayudarnos a traducir de mejor forma nuestras ideas en imágenes.
The lessons of the Russian Revolution, also in cinema, can help us to create a greater sense of our ideas translated into images in the struggle against capitalism.
La Revolución Rusa despertó a lo mejor de la sociedad.
The Russian Revolution awoke the best parts of society.
Hizo explotar una galaxia de artistas y talentos.
It was able to mobilize a galaxy of artists and talents.
Una de sus conquistas fue el contribuir con el montaje cinematográfico que quedó plasmado en la cinematografía universal.
One of its conquests was the great contribution of the montage, which was reflected exists today in the language of cinematography on a world scale.
El arte no necesita ser propaganda ni ser partidista.
Art doesn't have to be propaganda or bipartisan.
Pero la Revolución Rusa también nos dio ejemplos de arte comprometido y en muchos sentidos revolucionario.
But the Russian Revolution also gave us examples of dedicated art and in many senses revolutionary art.
El despertar explosivo del arte soviético de los primeros años es una muestra fehaciente del potencial que tendrá la futura sociedad socialista.
The explosive awakening of Soviet art in the first years of the revolution is an irrefutable demonstration of the potential that a future socialist society can have.
El socialismo nos permitirá el florecimiento del arte como nunca en la historia de la humanidad lo hayamos visto.
The socialist revolution will allow a great flourishing of art that we have never seen in the history of humanity.
Gracias, camaradas.
Thank you, comrades.
Thank you very much, Che. I will now bring in John McAnally from Britain.
As an active trade unionist for many years, I was privileged to have organised and helped lead a number of strikes. There is an observable phenomenon that happens in every strike and in a revolutionary period, but on a far wider scale. The best way I can describe this is the unleashing of potential. Had he not experienced a strike, a worker may well have spent the rest of their lives carrying on as before. For some workers, a strike can reveal previously unrecognized talents that are realized in conditions of struggle. And I don't just mean organizational talent, important as that is. I mean genuine creative talent. For example, the ability to write, and most of all, and this is a development which is transformational in character, and that is the ability to speak, the ability to express. The journey from realizing there is something to say to the impetus to actually say it and the act of actually saying it, fear and lack of confidence are overcome because the urge to say what must be said is greater. It is also notable that people who come through and reveal unsuspected potential in a strike often go on to develop a wider understanding, not just of society and politics, but what we call culture and art. They want to know how things work, what makes the world the way it is, and they want to question, understand, and as a natural extension of that process, express their opinion and their ideas and all of it. In the period immediately following the American Civil War, liberated slaves found themselves cast out into a world they were unprepared to navigate. Contemporary accounts describe that after securing the necessities of life, food and so on, their main priority for so many was to learn to read. Schools were set up, funded from meager wages. But one of the most extraordinary features of these schools was the demographic. It was not just the youth who attended, but after a hard day's work, a great many older people. What has this got to do with Marxism and art? I would say everything. They knew if they were to realize their potential as human beings and to understand the world, not just to advance in it, learning to read was the key to do so. And to learn about the world also implied they were able, capable, and willing to participate in it. For them, culture was not a take it or leave it issue. It was a road to real liberation of the mind. When the question is posed, why is art necessary? It is not one that those people would have considered in any depth, if at all, because they knew the answer. And it is also something that those, and in that period, the recently formed Ku Klux Klan also understood only too well. The terror they unleashed against the recently liberated slaves specifically targeted these schools. They knew that when people start to read, they get ideas. And inevitably, for the oppressor, they know the next state, they know the next step, which from their point of view means people getting ideas above their station, ideas that will set the ground for a challenge to the established order. When workers have access to culture, literature, representational art, and even music, it is for the ruling class a very risky business. When I was young, I knew family members and others who worked in various aspects of the construction industry. They were all manual workers. What I do remember is that there were some books that passed between groups of workers. I remember one which related the lives of itinerant Irish and Scottish labourers at the beginning of the 20th century. That book would be read by workers who otherwise would never dream of looking at one. And for the obvious reason, it reflected and described the life that they led. I also recall that such books would be passed around in families and workplaces. Such books would be regarded almost as items of communal property and discussion. The desire and need to develop an understanding and interpretation of the world is not the preserve of a particular privileged group or elite. It is, despite the many barriers and impediments erected in class society, an innately human and universal urge. There is one thing that connects the newly liberated slave, the building worker, or even those who made the cave drawings. They may not have had any grand series of art, but they understood their endeavors in relation not what it meant only to themselves, but to others. In other words, collectively. For them, there is no art for art's sake. The ruling class, who have a vested interest in society as it is currently constituted, invest much in producing art or culture that does not challenge the established order or the status quo. And when revolutionary work cannot be suppressed, much energy is expended in making it safe, respectable, and stripped of its revolutionary or radical content. But in our movement too, even amongst those who consider themselves as Marxists, there is a recognizable type. They have a quote from Lenin for every occasion, but show a certain contempt for art and culture. They regard themselves as serious people, and their political work is far too important for such distractions. Many working class people, even activists, can be effectively misled, even frightened, and made to feel guilty about developing cultural interests, in the process depriving themselves and others of access to what can enrich their lives and widen their understanding. As Marxists and revolutionaries, we must develop a broad perspective of what concerns human beings, what they read, listen to, and so on. So finally, why is any of this important? We have now entered a period of unprecedented instability, a period of reaction and revolution. If we are to navigate this period, we must prepare for all-out assaults on every front, including the cultural front. In fact, these battles are already being fought in the world of art and culture. If revolution has any aim, it must be to make it possible to realize the enormous potential of all human beings, not just some. Thank you for the opportunity to make these comments.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much, John. We will now bring in our last speaker before Alan replies. Paco from Mexico will speak in Spanish.
Ninguna sociedad ha sido tan hostil al arte como la sociedad capitalista.
No society has been so hostile to art as the capitalist society.
En la medida en que el arte es una creación individual y no un producto estandarizado,
in the sense that art is an individual creation and not a standardized product.
El arte representa, ante todo, un valor de uso irrepetible.
Art represents, above all, a use value that is unrepeatable.
Pero para poder subsistir en el marco de la sociedad burguesa,
But in order to subsist in the bourgeois society,
el artista debe admitir que su creación sea tratada como un valor de cambio.
the artist must admit that his creation has to be treated as a exchange value,
Como una mercancía cualquiera.
like any other commodity.
El filósofo soviético ucraniano Mikhail Lipschitz
The Soviet-Ukrainian philosopher Mikhail Lifshitz
afirmó que desde el punto de vista de las relaciones objetivas de la sociedad capitalista,
stated that from the point of view of the objective relations of capitalist society,
la máxima obra de arte es equivalente a una determinada cantidad de estiércol.
the greatest work of art is equivalent to a determined quantity of manure.
Esta contradicción fundamental
This fundamental contradiction
da forma a la gran división que caracteriza al arte en la actualidad.
gives shape to the great division that characterizes art in our day.
La sociedad burguesa ha creado, por una parte,
Bourgeois society has created, on one hand,
un arte estandarizado,
a standardized art
sometido a la ley de la producción capitalista,
under the law of capitalist production.
que reduce la experiencia del arte al entretenimiento,
It's reduced the experience of art to entertainment
y modela el gusto y las ideas del público bajo estándares muy pobres.
and it models the taste and ideas of the public on very low standards,
Un arte de masas.
an art of the masses.
Y por otra parte,
And on the other hand,
un arte superintelectualizado,
a super intellectualized art,
absolutamente inaccesible para el público no erudito,
completely inaccessible to a non-erudite or non-educated public,
que sirve para la especulación financiera,
which serves only for financial speculation,
enriqueciendo a una mafia de galerías exclusivas y coleccionistas privados.
enriching a mafia of exclusive galleries and private collections.
El llamado arte contemporáneo tiene una mala reputación.
The so-called contemporary art has a bad reputation.
El público general no está seguro de que este arte incomprensible justifique los elevados precios que alcanza en el mercado.
The general public is not sure that this incomprehensible art justifies the elevated prices that it reaches in the market.
El arte contemporáneo es permanentemente sospechoso de fraude.
Contemporary art is permanently suspected of fraud.
Sin embargo, la crítica burguesa lo tiene en una alta estima.
However, bourgeois critics hold it in high esteem.
Casi una década antes de que Francis Fukuyama hablara sobre el fin de la historia,
Almost 1 decade before Francis Fukuyama talked about the end of history,
el filósofo estadounidense Arthur Coleman Danto
the US philosopher Arthur Coleman Danto
se refirió al arte contemporáneo como el fin de la historia del arte.
referred to contemporary art as the end of art history.
Para los entusiastas del arte contemporáneo,
For the enthusiasts of contemporary art,
con su aleatoriedad,
with its randomness,
este había conquistado la máxima libertad para los artistas.
it has conquered or gained the greatest freedom for artists,
Que ya no estaban obligados a seguir un estilo ni a buscar la superación de los estilos históricos.
because they're not forced to follow a style or look to overcome or compete with historical styles.
Y más aún,
And furthermore,
el arte contemporáneo sería para ellos el único arte concebible para la única sociedad concebible.
Contemporary art is for them the only art that can be conceived of, the only conceivable art for the only conceivable society.
El arte del capitalismo por excelencia.
Capitalist art par excellence.
Sin embargo, la crítica burguesa,
However, bourgeois critics,
intencionadamente o por descuido,
intentionally or accidentally,
olvida explicar la forma como el arte contemporáneo fue moldeado por las relaciones sociales capitalistas de la posguerra.
forget to explain how contemporary art was formed by the capitalist social relations of the post-war period.
Pues sus expresiones radicales ya tenían antecedentes en el movimiento dadaísta e incluso en el vanguardismo soviético.
Well, their radical expressions already had their antecedents in the Dadaist movement and even in the Soviet vanguardism.
Mientras que el espíritu de experimentación del arte soviético anterior a la censura stalinista no tuvo nada que envidiar al arte contemporáneo,
Whilst the spirit of experimentation of Soviet art prior to the Stalinist censorship had nothing to be jealous of contemporary art,
el dadaísmo ya innovaba en la producción de modalidades artísticas poco convencionales.
Dadaism had already innovated in the production of artistic modalities that were not very conventional.
Pero las mismas no serían de interés general
But the same works would not be of general interest,
sino hasta que el arte abstracto ya había agotado las posibilidades formales del arte moderno.
if abstract art had not already exhausted all possibilities of formal modern art.
Y el mercado del arte necesitó de nuevas mercancías para satisfacer su creciente demanda.
And the art market needed new commodities to satisfy its growing demand.
Pero esto no significa que el arte contemporáneo sea una expresión automáticamente inválida.
But this means that contemporary art is not just an expression of immediate invalidity.
Incluso Lenin evitó censurar el arte vanguardista, aunque no gustaba de él.
Even Lenin refused to censor vanguardist art, even though he didn't like it.
Solo es absurda la forma como el arte contemporáneo es interpretado por los intelectuales posmodernos.
It's only absurd in the way that it's been interpreted by postmodernist intellectuals.
Como los artistas de Europa Oriental,
Like the artists of Eastern Europe,
que fueron calificados por accidente como los artistas de la dictadura comunista,
who were labeled by the West as artists of the communist dictatorship,
los artistas contemporáneos solo producen su creación a partir de las condiciones que les son dadas por la sociedad en la que se desenvuelven.
the contemporary artists only produce their creation from the conditions that are given in the society in which they develop.
El arte no es un reflejo mecánico de la ideología de la sociedad que lo produce.
Art is not a mechanical reflection of the ideology of the society that produces it,
sino que admite múltiples influencias.
but rather it allows multiple influences.
El arte tiene una independencia relativa.
Art has a relative independence.
Si bien los artistas con mayor éxito en el mercado del arte contemporáneo son más dependientes de la clase dominante,
If artists who are the most successful in the contemporary art market are the most dependent on the dominant class and their artistic taste,
los artistas marginales influenciados por estos
the marginal artists influenced by them
ven limitadas sus posibilidades como creadores por la sociedad capitalista.
see their possibilities limited as creators by the capitalist society,
Y tienen el potencial de ser influidos por ideas revolucionarias.
and they have the potential to be influenced by revolutionary ideas
Y por el movimiento revolucionario en sí mismo.
and by the revolutionary movement in itself.
Si estos artistas se desprenden del mito del fin de la historia del arte,
If these artists break apart from the myth of the end of the history of art,
su creación podrá convertirse en el heraldo de una nueva sociedad, del arte de una nueva sociedad.
their creation could become the herald of the art of a new society
en la que la socialización de la cultura
in which the socialization of culture
sea la condición no solamente de un arte nuevo,
is the condition not only of a new art
posterior al arte contemporáneo,
that will come after contemporary art,
sino también de una producción social libre de la enajenación.
but also a social production that is free from alienation.
El arte de la sociedad comunista
The art of communist society
será el arte de hombres y mujeres libres de toda explotación.
will be the art of men and women free from all types of exploitation.
Gracias.
Thank you.
An excellent contribution to finish on. This has been a really profound discussion, I think, which is helping to sharpen our ideas and improve our understanding of the world. And this is our most powerful weapon, as we know. And so with that in mind, as we're listening to Alan's summing up now, I want comrades to think about how we can strengthen that weapon in the weeks and months ahead by joining the IMT if you're not already a member, and by renewing your commitment to conquering these ideas if you have already begun to train yourself as a Marxist. So I'll bring in Alan now.
Well, I have a very difficult task, comrades. It's been a very rich discussion, unfortunately too short. But when I said earlier on that revolution is the highest form of social emancipation and cultural emancipation, I've seen this with my own eyes. I even saw the Russian Revolution almost through my own eyes. When I was studying in the Moscow State University in 1970, I had the good fortune to meet an old woman, a very old lady, who had been a Bolshevik, member of the Bolshevik Party. At the time of the revolution, I think she was a school teacher in some part of the Volga region. And like so many others, she'd been imprisoned in one of Stalin's notorious concentration camps in Siberia. She must have suffered terribly, and the suffering was etched on her face. And she would never talk about that. But one day I asked her about the October Revolution. Now she was old and bent, her eyes were dim, and yet I will never forget the extraordinary transformation that came over her face when I asked that question. Her eyes shone, and she said to me, "You can't imagine what that was like." And she said in Russian, "Какой подъем?" It's difficult to translate those words, but you can express it as a great uplift, even a kind of spiritual uplift of the masses. And then instantly the expression on her face changed. She shook her head, and she said in a whisper, "Not like now." Now, you see, to me, that summed up the whole experience of the October Revolution. And one has to imagine it, this spiritual uplift. And Comrade Nelson, in his excellent intervention, he talked about the theaters being full of workers and soldiers. And that's perfectly true. Following the October Revolution, the Bolshevik theater and all the other theaters, which used to be the monopoly of the rich and the middle class, were suddenly filled to overflowing with workers and peasants and the grey coats of soldiers coming straight from the front to listen to great music and to enter into a magical world of culture which they never knew existed. That is the essential meaning of the October Revolution, and not all the atrocious lies that these bastards are spreading. I thought that Nelson made a very fine description of the world of theatre, the enormous transformation of the world of theatre. Geniuses like Stanislavski and Meyerhold, he mentioned. I'm pretty sure that, if I'm not mistaken, that he was murdered by Stalin, actually. And many great artists and poets and writers were murdered by this monstrous regime. Now, as Comrade Nelson pointed out quite correctly, the Bolsheviks did not clamp down on artistic freedom. That's a damned lie. There was complete freedom of discussion and debate throughout the 1920s, actually. And totalitarianism and bureaucracy, by the way, is the death of art. That was true of Hitler's Germany, and it was also true of Stalin's Russia. Now, Carlos Che made some very interesting points about cinema. He mentioned some directors. I must confess that I don't know these directors, but I'm a very great admirer of Sergei Eisenstein. I personally consider he's the greatest cinema director of all times. All his films are remarkable. I strongly recommend all the comers to see these films. Not just the early film Strike, which is about to strike before the revolution. The Battleship Potemkin, which Nelson mentioned, which is an absolute classic. October. But also his other films, his historical films, which Nelson didn't mention. Alexander Nevsky and Ivan the Terrible. He got into trouble over Alexander Nevsky, over Ivan the Terrible, rather. The first part was okay, but the second part, which describes the terrible dictatorship of Ivan the Terrible, it was a little bit too close for comfort as far as the Stalinists were concerned. So he wasn't actually purged, but in effect, he was silenced. You see, the chief intellectual hallmark of the bureaucrat is conservative philistinism and national narrowness, a total lack of imagination, an aversion to innovation and experiment, and a strong tendency towards conformity and control. After all, if you think about it, conservative routine is the guiding principle of every bureaucracy. Rules and regulations take the place of revolutionary initiative. The routine of the apparatus replaces the freedom of the innovator. So the revolution succumbs to reaction, and the Philistine replaces the rebel. On such a barren soil, the promise of early Soviet art was slowly suffocated and throttled. By the way, the last comrade who spoke from Mexico raised some interesting points. And I think he was probably referring to my very sharp criticism of so-called modern art. And he asked the question, well, surely artists have got the right to experiment. I agree with that. And it's not our business, not my business, not anybody's business, to tell artists how to paint or writers how to write or composers how to compose. They should write or compose or paint whatever is inside them, what's in their soul, what they wish to express, of course. And they must be free to do this without interference, whether it's from the state or from the church or from Alan Woods. It doesn't make any difference. Of course, and the comment is quite right. Lenin never conceived of prohibiting, for example, the writings of Mayakovsky. He wasn't very keen on them. It's true. Sometimes it's true. He grumbled about it. That's true. He sometimes grumbled about it. Yes, because they were starving at the time. There were shortages of everything, and there was a shortage of paper. So when they said that Mayakovsky, I've forgotten which poem it was going to be published in a big edition, he moaned about it. He said, "What the hell are you doing wasting all this paper?" But when they explained to him that these poems are very popular with the workers, he said, "Oh, well, okay, go ahead, publish it." I come back to the last speaker if I have time later on. Adam Pal made some very interesting point about the culture of the Indian subcontinent. And Indian classical music, of course, is a special field of investigation about which I'm not the most competent person to speak. But I have been to Pakistan on many occasions, maybe 20 times, as Adam knows. And it is most impressive what he was saying. I don't know if the communists realize what he was saying. How the communists make use of revolutionary poetry. It's a tradition that's been lost in the West. But every single Congress that I've ever attended in Pakistan, the first item was comrades would come up to the platform, very often very young comrades, to read revolutionary poetry which they'd written themselves and sing revolutionary songs. And there's a big effect on people. Or these are workers and peasants I'm talking about. That's why I say that it's complete nonsense to say that workers and peasants are not capable of understanding and appreciating music and poetry and culture. It's a lie. It's a slander. It's a disgraceful calumny, as a matter of fact. And music and songs can be a revolutionary weapon, it's true. Now, to come back to some very interesting points made by the last comment from Mexico, I didn't get his name. Paco, I think that's right. He asked, do artists have the right to experiment? I answered, of course, they do. Yes, but as in science, as you know, Paco, not every experiment is a successful one. Many experiments are failures. And who decides whether this art is any good or not? Who decides how much it's worth? Who decides whether it will be shown or not shown? And that Paco answered his own question. There's no doubt about it. There's a mafia that controls all the outlets of culture, all of them. A mafia that controls the galleries, the concert halls, the publishing houses. Yes, and the artists themselves have become commodities to be bought and sold as well, I'll say that. There's a tiny elite of artists who sold themselves to the big business. And they themselves are a tiny elite of pampered individuals who are merely the hired prostitutes of the art mafia. I'll say that, you can put that in writing and you can quote me. The hired prostitutes are people like Damien Hirst and people of that sort, or Jeff Koons. And when Paco says people suspect that a lot of this is mere fraud, I agree with them. It is damn fraud. A lot of it can't even be considered as art. I mean that quite seriously. And yet, you see, there's another side to this, Paco. Hundreds of thousands of good young artists and museums are denied access to the means of culture. They will not be admitted to their work will never be shown. And therefore, I think Paco and I agree that art will only be free. These young artists will only emerge. They will emerge during a revolution, when art becomes free from the shackles of big business, from the mafia, which is crushing art, as a matter of fact. Again, Comrade John McAnally is a good friend of mine, a working class militant of many years of experience. And he made an important point. He said, there's no such thing as art for art's sake. I don't know who it was. I think it was Plekhanov that said, there's no such thing as art for art's sake. After all, he said, there's no such thing as carpentry for carpentry. Nobody speaks about carpentry for carpentry's sake. And John's final remarks, I thought, came right to the point. What is the real purpose of the socialist revolution? I think it was the utopian socialist Fourier, if I'm not mistaken, who said that that socialism is really to make reality what was always implicitly there. The ruling class, of course, does not want an educated working classes. That's the truth. They want the workers to know the minimum which is necessary to run their machines and so on. But of course, that's not socialism. That's not real civilization. And I think that the meaning of this discussion today, in the short time at our disposal, it's not possible to deal with this great big subject very seriously. Some of the comrades know that years ago I promised to write a book about Marxism and art. I never finished it. But before Comrade Emma asks me, reminds me of it, I'm sure he will. On my desktop here in front of me, I must have about 200,000 words already written on this subject. It just needs to be put together, that's all. But I've got some other things to do first. As you know, I've got some other little tasks first, particularly a book on Marxist philosophy. So after that, we can consider it again. But just a final word. If this discussion today has served no other useful purpose, I hope at least that it will serve to make people think. You know, Trotsky said once, if all else fails, if you've got really no alternative, start to think. Think about what we're discussing today. And above all, it's necessary for us to raise our horizons, raise our vision, to realize the cause that we're really fighting for, which is neither more nor less than the salvation of human civilization. 10,000 years of civilization is threatened with destruction, threatened with barbarism. And look at the golden opportunities that now open up before the whole human race. I repeat what the Bible says. Man shall not live by bread alone. What are we fighting for? We say, work for everybody, of course. A house for everybody, of course. a decent wage and pensions and so on, of course, all those things. Yes, but that's just minus, that's just the beginning. That's not socialism. That's only the beginning. The purpose of socialism is precisely to raise the productive forces to such a level that, in effect, the working week could be reduced to almost nothing. I mean, even I think it was yesterday on the news, they announced that, I think it was Amazon or one of those big companies, they have an enormous warehouse. No, it wasn't Amazon. It's not. It's Waitrose, a big Ocado. That's Ocado, a British distribution firm. They take orders for food to be distributed to people's houses online, and they got a huge building, which takes the orders, selects them, packages them, and so on and so forth. All done by robots, and it's done precisely, more precisely than with workers. They still have one or two workers for quality purpose, quality control. Just think, under socialism, the general application of this kind of technology, what does it mean? Potentially, you could reduce the working week not to 30 hours. That's nonsense. You could immediately introduce it to 30 hours tomorrow, but then very quickly, on the basis of a 5-year plan, you could reduce the working week to 5 hours, 2 hours, 3 hours, perhaps 1 hour. And what does that mean? For the first time in history, the masses will have the same access to freedom, genuine freedom, that the ruling class possesses. Trotsky once said, how many Aristotles are herding swine? And how many swineherds are sitting on thrones, he added. There is an enormous amount of talent which is being wasted. Scientists, of course, sportsmen and women, singers and dancers, and artists, of course. They're there. Yes, but they will never have the opportunity to develop their talents. Under this system, it'll be crushed out of them. Think about it. You're talking about a complete freedom now for the first time, which will permit what? It'll permit for the first time genuine human relationships, complete equality between men and women, and the freedom to develop physically and mentally and spiritually, one would use that expression. It will enable the human race to raise its vision, to look at the stars, the universe. That's the next great frontier, isn't it? The conquest of space. Capitalism has posed the question, but they can't carry it any further because it requires all the resources of the planet. And of course, now multimillionaires can go into space. You know, they pay a lot of money. I wouldn't mind going into space myself. You know, I wouldn't mind visiting the planet Mars and so on and so forth. I might not make it, but that's what socialism means. And therefore, under socialism, you can talk about a genuine cultural revolution. To draw a parallel, it would be like a new Renaissance. Imagine the world of Leonardo da Vinci and all the others. It's great, and Rembrandt, all the great geniuses, but on a far higher level, uniting all the resources of the planet in the cause of developing the human race, so that once and for all, the human race can be raised up to its true stature.